It's funny. Last week on the episode, we talked a lot about how timing is important for AI innovation. So vector databases have been around for a really long time. They've been particularly important with music or with sounds because you do you create embeddings. Like historically, you create embeddings with like the Fourier transform, if I remember correctly, and then you can store those and begin to match similarities based on that. But we've come into this new sort of this new age where an older technology is becoming more mainstream and really practical now because the other technologies have sort of created an opportunity for it. So like you have this aggressive advancement here and it's like, oh, this thing that we already built now is more usable than it was ever before. And I find that concept fascinating.
So, I'm up in my office upstairs, but downstairs I have a book on my shelf, which is like an intro to machine learning. And it's what we read in college. But it talks about the first like real machine learning and neural net projects. And they're from like the 80s and 90s. Like they're not from like, super recent. Like neural nets, these models, image recognition, it has existed for a long time. Like the early, kind of goals in self-driving cars were just making a car that could go like in a circle and follow like kind of like, cones or something. And it was a technology that existed, neural nets existed, and really the breakthrough was with GPUs and compute power. Like that's where it came. And suddenly, like if you compare a GPU nowadays to a CPU back then, we're talking about like probably, God, I'm estimating this a bit, but like hundreds of thousands of times the speed. Like it's not like a small incremental gain. What?
Yeah, I think dramatically more than that. Even like
it could be dramatic. I guess it really depends how far back you go. You're right, because if you go back in the beginning, like things got super slow. I guess I'm thinking like from the first advent of like, let's say home computers. So that's probably like 2005. I don't know, around then, 2000, like maybe 100,000 times or 1,000,000 times around then. Either way, it's an obscene number. And so what's funny is the tech and the algorithms existed, but just you couldn't train on that much data, right? Like images, like we didn't even have the storage to hold images of that size. We didn't have the RAM to process them. Whereas now, like, my laptop here, like I'm a data scientist, I use it heavily, so it's a bit souped up, but like it's a MacBook with 32 gigs of RAM. Like that is so much when you really think about it. Like that is more than like, computers had even just, that's more like than the hard drive space that computers used to have when I first kind of got a computer. Like I remember thinking about like, oh, do I get the 50 gigabyte or the 100 gigabyte hard drive, which is like way more money. And now I could exceed that amount just in RAM.
Well, I mean, the example you hear all the time is that, our cell phone has dramatically more compute power than what we were using to send whatever, I forgot what the rocket was, to the moon, right?
Totally.
Like dramatically more.
Yeah, it's again on the order of like that millions or billions when you go back that. I mean, literally just like, my phone, I don't know exactly, but it might have like 4 CPUs and there are 4 cores, each running at 3 to maybe 2 gigahertz, right? So you're talking about it calculating about 8 billion calculations a second, right? And that's just 0 and 1's additions, but those are calculations. Back then, you were talking like on the order of like kilohertz, right? So thousands a second. So you went from thousands on like the highest end like NASA grade stuff you get to now just like I just bought a phone that can do this at the rate of like 8 billion. And it's not only that, it's everything that goes along with it. Like you have a CPU that can do calculations, and let me know if I'm getting too kind of into the weeds here. But like there's this whole kind of like movement of like data from like where it is on disk to get it into CPU so it can be processed. Like even if you just have an array of numbers, let's say you want to sum it and it's on your hard drive, like the normal process originally was like spin your disk. Literally, you have a 5400 RPM hard drive disk, spin it, find that value, load it into RAM. But then RAM has a clock speed. It can only go so fast. It was slower back then. You have to load into RAM, and then you load it into like these caches that are right next to the CPU, like the registers. I think maybe it's an L3. Maybe L3 is RAM. I think L2 is the one that's right near your CPU, and then L1 is the one that's right next to the chip. It has to go through all of these, and they're pretty small, so they can only hold so much. And so that whole process has to happen. Nowadays on my MacBook, right? Like I open a file, it's going to be held just entirely in RAM, right? And in fact, if I was like using like let's say I was just doing something simple like an Excel file and summing stuff up, or like Jupyter Notebook, loading some Python array, summing something up, it's going to be moved into RAM. And then the CPU is going to say, hey, you seem to be accessing these memory locations a lot. Let me hold it in the L2 cache right next to your CPU. So then you get incredibly fast speeds. I think it's somewhere around 100x speed up with each step. And so, you see, you'll see Apple advertisements now. Like they don't like everything used to be about clock speed, like, 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz. But that's plateaued a bit. Instead, it's more about like L2 cache, number of cores, how efficient it is, different types of cores, and these all affect your speed. So now you have to compare the speed of a computer using something like Geekbench.